No, that's the wrong speech. Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Stacy.
Max, we are going to do a doubleheader here because we have a big theme to cover in this show. And I want to say that I was looking at some of the speeches from Joe Biden recently and with the legislation and tax policies he's hoping to introduce. And what you see in that is a recognition of the Great Reset, the end of the US dollar as world reserve currency, the recognition of the Triffin Dilemma, which was inevitably going to cause the destruction of the US dollar. And that is because he wants to take the US 50% renewable. And if you don't have a petrodollar, you don't have the dollar, right? So that's the theme we're going to head towards, especially in the second half. But I want to start off, this is what triggered it. This conversation here triggered it. So this, mainstream media sort of economist here, Josh Wolf, tweeted, "Crypto makes a ton of sense if we lived in utopia with global peace and slim variations in governance and human rights. It ought to be the basis for a universal system. Until then, the US dollar has far-reaching strategic importance, precisely why China and Russia want it gone."
This is an interesting inflection point that we are living through now. The fall of the US dollar as world reserve currency, the rise of Bitcoin as a universal hard money that has great attributes that will bring peace and monetize peace versus fiat money, which is really the monetization of war and violence. And this gentleman, Josh Wolf, he's having trouble wrapping his mind around it, which is not hard to understand because it's a very big concept. You really have to take a step back and look at the big picture. And that's not easy to do for a lot of folks.
As we get into this conversation, into this report from Lynn Alden, what you'll see is that China does not wish the dollar gone. In fact, they've benefited massively from it. So they've just played the game very well. They understood the Triffin Dilemma, the fact that anybody with a reserve currency, any nation with a reserve currency, has to run huge trade deficits and thus inevitably weaken themselves and collapse their own currency. So they saw that. They're not stupid, and they saw that that was coming. Unlike Saudi Arabia, unlike Europe, unlike Japan before it, it didn't play the game. It stopped playing the game in 2013 when it did the Belt and Road instead of recycling all their surplus into treasuries. So that's where everything has changed since 2013. And we're heading toward a neutral reserve currency unit of account like Bitcoin. You had responded to him, nope, elastic fiat US dollar promotes violence and war. Inelastic Bitcoin promotes peace. There is no reason to be defeatist with Bitcoin ridding us of fiat and central banks. The report that we're going to get to, the fraying of the US global currency reserve system from Lynn Alden, it mentions exactly that a lot of violence is needed in order to sustain the US dollar as reserve currency backed by oil. So it has to resort to violence in order to continue to force people to accept the US dollar, being the pricing mechanism for oil. But right now, so you're saying that the fact that, basically Bitcoin promotes peace because it is inelastic like that.
Right. It's hard money. It's like St. Francis of Assisi, I believe, said, God, let me be chaste, but maybe tomorrow, right? We know that in order to survive as a species, we're going to have to embrace peace. And these childish games of throwing bricks at each other have run their conclusion because we've basically exhausted the planet's carrying capacity for humans. And the planet is choking on its human population right now, and it's now sending a pretty strong signal that Mother Earth would prefer it if humans were no longer around. So as a result, the only way we can ingratiate ourselves with Mother Nature is to have a breakout in peace and to show her that we are, in fact, mature as a species and not childish throwing our poop around. And so Josh Wolf is unwilling to get out of the diapers and stand up and be an adult.
Right. And when the Triffin Dilemma, what happens to the reserve currency nation like the US dollar post-World War II, Keynes saw it coming. He knew what was going to happen. And what would happen is you've got to have the trade deficit. And that means you got to send your gold overseas. So We unpegged in 1971, and what we did instead was, peg to the petrodollar, which extended the game for a bit. But if you don't have gold to send overseas, you've got to have your basically your industrial base. So that has been hollowed out since 1971. That was exactly as a result of the U.S. dollar as reserve. You have to send the U.S. dollars overseas. So that's destabilized the domestic population, as we see constantly getting worse and worse, as the hopelessness, as the dawning of the realization that it's not going back with this system, that there's no getting our jobs back no matter what. They're all in China, Vietnam, Cambodia, all Asia, Mexico, Latin America. They're not coming back here. You write, again, in response to this guy, Josh Wolf, in my view, having a global Bitcoin standard separating state from money, universally accessible, has the power to affect all people in a profoundly positive way, demonetizing war and violence. I can see this very clearly. I'm not the only one.
Right. Well, to your point that you've been making really for quite some time is that the empire of debt, the U.S. dollar as world reserve currency, is really hugely penalizing to the American population. And we see that what's happened now. Because the trade deficits are a prerequisite for having world reserve currency, because in order to have people buy your stuff with dollars, you've got to ship those dollars out. And so that's what we've been doing for 40 years and made all these other countries super rich, like China, and impoverished the United States. And as you've pointed out yourself a few times, look at Europe. Once they lost their empires, actually quality of life for Europeans went up. Once they had to shut down all their colonial outposts, European life, quality of life went up. So presumably the U.S., if there wasn't the world reserve currency called the U.S. dollar, and we shut down the empire of debt, and we shut down the 400 or 500 military bases we have around the world that do absolutely nothing but drain the coffers of the state, the quality of life in America would zoom higher. And that's what Josh Wolf doesn't really understand. He likes to pull out a few tropes about our existential enemies doing this and doing that, and it's all very Hollywood. But the economics of it don't support his jingoism, and the economics are established. And the fact of the matter is, if the U.S. dollar were allowed to collapse, quality of life for the average American would skyrocket.
Josh Wolf is not an average American. He is a blue tick New York Times, Wall Street Journal sort of editorialist. Those are the beneficiaries. They receive a very exorbitant privilege from the rest of the world. They get to print dollars. It's even less work than the Saudi princes, the 7,000 princes have to do. They at least have to drill a well. These guys don't even have to drill a well. They just sit there and drill dollars, like print dollars. So, this brings us to the fraying of this. And this is what we're seeing with the very elite versus the population, the winners versus the losers, as Hillary called them, the deplorables versus the ruling class. So Lynn Alden responded to this conversation as well. And she said, in response to Josh Wolf saying that the U.S. dollar is the best thing to ever happen, she's like, quite to the contrary. U.S. dollar hegemony continues to benefit Chinese interests over U.S. interests. A small portion of U.S. residents benefit from the system as structured, while most U.S. workers get displaced under the current system. Hence, populism emerges. She just shows a chart of 2000. Of course, as we always point out, that's the pivotal year. That's the last year as Clinton exited the White House, passed the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, which allowed derivatives to basically hollow out the U.S. economy and the U.S. elite to extract huge amounts of equity. But also they repealed the Glass-Steagall Act to also destabilize the financial system. And they elevated China into the WTO on favored nation status. So the blue, all that blue you see, that was the United States represented as the #1 global trade partner back in 2000. That's the position we were in 2000. This is 2018. Red is all China. So China has become, in those 18 years, the #1 global trading partner for all of those countries.
Yeah, and I can tell you why it accelerated like at this incredible pace was that starting in 2000, we started to have no compunction whatsoever about bailing out corrupt bankers. Mm-hmm. And that's what accelerated the collapse. And you see that in the collapse in the money velocity numbers. We simply as New York City did in the 70s, municipal governments threw the keys to Wall Street. Lazard Frere was a banker, and it was the rise of Donald Trump, as a matter of fact, came out of that. So the federal government is mimicking this behavior, particularly since 2000, saying, we in Washington give up. We're abdicating our role as representatives of the people. We're simply going to throw the keys to the bankers. And the bankers went ahead and printed themselves $25 trillion worth of money, and they kept most of it. When they were caught committing fraud, Eric Holder, of course, the Attorney General under Bill Clinton, would give them a pass, like a papal indulgence of the Middle Ages, and say, look, these guys are systemically important. You know, as Trump would say, you know, they could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, and they'd be no penalty whatsoever. That's Jamie Dimon's life. So now we have the results, and we have some crisis, and we have people like Josh Wolf, who's a blue check guy, furiously stenographer that he is, pumping out talking points directly from, you know, the propaganda center in Washington. And but it's not washing anymore. People, particularly the millennials, are like, you know, we do not believe a single word you're saying.
Well, when you're in a fishbowl of exorbitant privilege, you might not understand. You might just think, just as Marie Antoinette assumed she was divinely appointed to rule, like that there is a certain divine right that you have, and that it's always been this way, and it will always continue this way. But you know, the fact is that this U.S. dollar, you know, we've elected a president, by the way, that was born prior to Bretton Woods. So this is all because of Bretton Woods that we see this. And now we're probably going to a pre-Bretton Woods-like situation again with the Great Reset. And that is already set in motion. I think is going to start to happen. And, you know, this is the story of what all the unrest, the discord you see throughout U.S. society is really this. This is the MAGA story. This is the deplorable story. This is what's going on. And the elite, the exorbitant privilege, nobody gives up privilege willingly. Nobody wants to. They know this, the anger from the elite, from the MSNBC and CNN sort of hosts, they understand in their heart where it comes from. And they don't want to give up that privilege, do they? Like, who wants to ever go to work again, right? You don't. Like, if you're getting free money, you don't want to have to actually work. And so, like, you don't want to have to lose the U.S. You can't keep your reserve currency and have any jobs for your domestic population.
Right. Let's continue this after the break. This is getting interesting. Don't go away. We'll be back. Hey, we're back. Max and Stacy doing it. The distance, getting into it. Yes.
Right. So in the first half, Max, I had established my prediction that what we're going to see under the Biden administration is an abandonment of the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. It's a recognition of what is happening anyway by the force of entropy that always sets in with the Triffin Dilemma. So the Triffin Dilemma means that even the Bank of International Settlements, the central bank of central banks, wrote a piece about this 2 or 3 years ago, establishing that the U.S. dollar was also encountering the Triffin Dilemma and explaining this as part of the unrest back domestically, that you have to have a huge trade deficit, and that means you have to send all your manufacturing overseas. Now, since we went off the gold standard in 1971, we've basically had a petrodollar, but that set in motion something that can't sustain itself because the U.S. is a shrinking economy as a percentage of world GDP. During the Bretton Woods time, it was 40% of GDP. It is now down to 20 to 25%. On nominal basis, if you do purchasing power parity, it's only 15% of GDP. So there's not enough actual production or wealth created here to send overseas. There's not enough compared to the rest of the world. Like, the rest of the world is getting bigger and bigger. Their economies are getting bigger. So if the petrodollar is the only way, really the number one way we're sending dollars overseas, buying oil, and the rest of the world buying oil in dollars, and you're starting to see nations like China, like Russia, sell or purchase oil in non-US dollar currencies. So if that is declining, how do you increase it? Well, Biden saying that we're going 50% renewables cuts it even further. So what are you going to have to compensate for it? And on top of that, he wants the U.S. to be produce their own lithium and produce their own ingredients for the battery technology for electric vehicles, for example. So again, the signal, the signs are that they're getting ready for a post-U.S. dollar reserve system, which again, like as we keep on saying, I think it'll be better for the vast majority of the population. They might not understand it because we only have mainstream media, and anybody who is on CNN or MSNBC is likely to lose in a post-U.S. dollar reserve currency world. They'll lose their exorbitant privilege, but the ordinary person will gain some more privilege.
Yeah, what's hard to see is the secular changes over half a century or more. And America post-World War II was in an unbelievably fantastic global position. It had, remember, huge gold stocks at that point. It had, of course, all its manufacturing was intact. It wasn't destroyed during World War II.
Yes.
It was in a position to do like the Marshall Plan and end up essentially controlling Europe. Japan became a vassal state, right? So all of these things happened in post-World War II globally, and America essentially was the American century, is what we call it. Now, entropy sets in, as it does in all systems and states. And over 50, 60, 70 years, that winning hand has been depleted. And so what happens is this administration comes in and they'll look back maybe 10 or 20 years and they'll say, well, we need to switch to renewables and get us off oil. But they don't see that if you look at the bigger picture, the 50 to 100-year picture, that, as you point out here and explain, it's like the death knell for the dollar, which is a petrodollar. And what that'll do is to speed up really a collapse in living standards is what we're talking about at the end of the day. Yeah,
I mean, people understood this long ago. They knew when they were setting out and devising this Bretton Woods system that this would be the problem for the U.S. dollar. Keynes pointed it out. That's why he was suggesting a bancor. They knew, but that's our business model, right? Keep on extend and pretend. And one day we'll sort it out and we'll never get to that point where we have to, it'll be somebody else's problem. But I think it's interesting that Biden was born in 42, 2 years before Bretton Woods was even organized. And now will probably be in office as we exit Bretton Woods. And here's two charts. One of them we've seen many times, and that is the gap between productivity and a typical worker's compensation has increased dramatically since 1979. This is the end of Bretton Woods, when we went off the gold standard, then the beginning of the petrodollar. And as you see, the elite have run off with all of the productivity gains since then, since there was no peg to reality, to a real currency. But this also shows that 2000 was a crucial year in terms of the wealth gap between the bottom 90% and the top 1%. The blue line on the bottom is the top 1%. And this goes back to 1990. And so you see that the bottom 90% used to have close to 40% of US GDP. And now it's closer to 30%. So they've lost significantly since 1990. The elites who have the exorbitant privilege, they've benefited. These are all the people that you see on the cable news in America. They've found ways to basically dehumanize these people, right? That these are racist, they're deplorables, that they want to make America great again. They want that. They want to return to where they came from. They want 40% of US GDP. This is the conflict you see. It's not just from the bottom up. You see it from the top down, like the punching down at these people.
Right. Also in the year 2000 was what you could call the reverse Gutenberg press moment, in that pre-Gutenberg press, knowledge was monopolized by the church, and then you had the press and you had books. In 2000, gave us Google, and all knowledge is now filtered through the search engine of Google at a premium and filtered, essentially managed and censored. We don't have free access to knowledge anymore. Our knowledge comes to us through a search engine. It's primarily Google, and like the church of the Middle Ages, they tell us what's the right and what's wrong. So we've gone back to the Middle Ages in that sense. And the consequences are a population that has been dumbed down to the point of the average IQ has probably been hit by 30 or 40 points.
Well, I mean, certainly the cable news is nonstop, and it distracts and confuses with a lot of propaganda about basically getting the deplorables to support this system, which benefits a very, very few, as Lynn Alden's report points out. Again, like, this is the system. I'm going to show you here some data that will show you that we are right, that you will be better off if you're American. If you're the bottom 90% of Americans, you'll be better off without that exorbitant privilege for the elite. According to the 2019 Credit Suisse Wealth Report, although the United States is wealthy per capita, because that wealth is so concentrated, the median American net worth, which represents the 50th percentile, the middle person on the spectrum, is actually lower than the median net worth of most other advanced countries. We squeezed our middle and working classes harder than most other countries. So the left chart is mean wealth, which includes Jeff Bezos into the room of the bar that you're at, whereas the median net worth is like 50% are making less, 50% making more. It's remarkable. The U.S. has one of the highest mean wealths in the world compared to Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Spain, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom, but the second lowest of the median wealth. So our wealthy are extraordinarily wealthy. Our average worker is extraordinarily poor compared to other nations. Like, Australians make over 3 times as much, have over 3 times as much wealth as the average American.
Statistically, it tells a different story, right? Jeff Bezos walks into a bar and suddenly the average person in that bar is a billionaire because he's got 200 billion.
Yeah.
Okay, but when he leaves the bar, the average person in that bar is now living worse than 20 other industrialized countries, and is living really poorly in America, and it's getting much worse. Life expectancy is dropping. Infant mortality rising. That's not a country that's in good state of health.
It shows you the Triffin Dilemma and the entropy that it causes in the domestic economy that is running the reserve currency. And again, this collapse was always going to happen, but has been accelerated indeed by China. China intentionally has pulled the rug. This is a rug pull, essentially, on the US dollar. In 2013, when they stopped buying US treasuries and accumulating treasuries and other US assets, and instead used those dollars to lend to Africa, to lend to Asia, to lend all across the world to build infrastructure. And instead, they launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013. China began aggressively lending dollar-based loans for infrastructure projects to developing countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Eastern Europe, and providing their infrastructure building capabilities as well, because infrastructure has long been one of China's technical specialties. Many of those foreign loans, if defaulted on, mean that China gains ownership of the infrastructure. So whether the loans are successful or not, China gains access to commodity deals, trading partners, and hard assets around the world. This is a direct result of the US dollar as reserve currency. China played by the rules, and those were the rules. Like, the rules were, you take our dollars, send us all your goods, and they did that. And then instead of deploying it back into treasuries and just feeding the exorbitant privilege of the Rachel Maddows of the world, it went towards actually changing the rules of the game, essentially.
Right, and getting back to Josh Wolf, the columnist for the Blue Ticks, he's casting aspersions toward China and trying to position them as an existential threat.
Yes.
But, China's got a right to their own sovereign state. They can have their own country too, They don't need to be a vassal state of America. So it's something America could have avoided. Entirely.
Lynn Alden does point out that we're going to start demonizing these countries, but the fact is, it's the system. It was always going to happen. We knew back in 1944 that this would happen. It was inevitable. It happens every time. This is the structure of a Triffin Dilemma, and there was no way around it. But the fact is that it'll be better in the long run. It will be better for the vast majority of people. And, they have to get ready for good times, because when it ends, it'll be better for them. She points out that because the U.S. economy is shrinking, that's also causes the inevitable. That's part of the Triffin Dilemma. Like the economy would shrink as you hollow out the economy, as people don't have jobs, and that's what you see the recognition of this with the introduction of this renewable energy, the fact that they're not going to support the petrodollar anymore, and also that. Basically, they're going to start like doubling the tax on capital gains. So what are they going to do? They're going to encourage more debt, right? Because if capital gets taxed, then they're just going to accumulate more debt on top of it. So that's the only way to escape the 43% on capital gains if you're very wealthy, is accumulate more debt. So, I just think it's kind of the end of the road of this.
As Confucius says, he who encourages Triffin Dilemma ends up with overpriced electric vehicles. All right, thank you. We're going to leave you now, but thanks for watching. Until next time, bye, y'all.